Well, it's definitely a pleasure to come to these kind of events. I think I learn more than I actually deliver, but I hopefully today will talk enough about the climate of Sauvignon Blanc in Lake County that it will bring up, I think, questions that we can all kind of discuss later on throughout the day. I noticed also within the program that the very first piece in here, written by David Glancy, says that Sauvignon Blanc is the most versatile variety. And I think we're going to see a little bit of that from the climate overview that I'm going to do for the next 20 minutes or so. So what I would like to do is talk about weather, climate, and wine. And I think some of this is pretty much a given, you guys know, but I think it's worth going through. I'll talk about the relationships between weather and climate in Sauvignon Blanc that I know from about 25 years of doing research in this area. And we'll talk a little bit about Lake County and Sauvignon Blanc, and then look at a summary of information. So the very first thing, I think it's pretty straightforward. Combined, weather and climate are the most basic and most profound environmental factors that we have for growing grapes worldwide. We know that it produces the characteristic suitability for what can be grown where and how. We know that it produces the wine styles that potentially can be produced within those areas. We know that it produces substantial crop risk factors, and we know that it produces vintage variations in production and quality. Now, this is not to say that geology, landscape, and soil are not important. They clearly are, because they help mediate the relationship between weather and climate in the vine, especially soil, water, nutrition, and water supply. Jacques will be talking about this in a few moments, but I think this is really important because it produces all the subtle differences, the nuances, and the expression of terroir that we all like to pursue. Wine regions, of course, have developed worldwide where climate was most conducive to producing wine. But climates of wine regions vary tremendously. Some are more at the margin of the climate, being very cool or even on the warmer end, but mostly on the cool end of the margin. Some have warmer days, some have warmer nights. Some are drier, some are wetter. Some are much more risk prone, and some less so. And others tend to be quite equitable and consistent. So the question often comes when we talk about climate and growing grapes and wine, is there a structure that's best suited to grow any variety in any place in the world? I'm not sure we know that answer. I think there's a lot to be learned still from this after studying it for quite a long time, and hopefully we can help discuss that a little bit more today. If you look at the old world Sauvignon Blanc in France mostly, it was historically planted in intermediate maritime climates, meaning not too hot, it wasn't too cold, but there were more maritime climates that typically had higher humidity, which results in lower maximum temperatures, higher minimum temperatures, and lower diurnal temperature ranges for most places. New World Sauvignon Blanc regions have been planted across quite a vast array of different climate landscapes and types. Some are warmer, some are much colder than the old world areas. They often have much drier conditions, we'll see that in a little bit. And then we also have much higher diurnal temperature ranges, and you'll see some data from that as well. Going to this next slide, I put this up because I took a challenge when Glenn, where's Glenn? When Glenn asked me to come speak at this event a year or so ago, I took the challenge to kind of think about this and look at Sauvignon Blanc and where it's grown and talk a little bit about some of the climates that are out there. I've done a similar kind of a study for Pinot Noir, Riesling, and Cabernet Sauvignon, but all of these are kind of unpublished. I usually run to a conference and put it together to talk about it. And that's what we're going to do today. I wanted to show you a little bit about what we know about the climates of Sauvignon Blancs worldwide. I grabbed data from these locations here. Unfortunately, I didn't have data from Chile. I wish I did. The problem is that getting good quality data from climate data from some places is difficult. I also don't have data from South Africa here. Sorry, Phil. Some of you know I've produced this diagram from about my 30 years of work looking at different varieties, trying to book in just basic climate structure, temperature during the growing season, on where varieties are being grown worldwide. And so we know that much of this is pretty straightforward. We know that temperature is a pretty good measure of where we find things being produced and grown. There's this idea of suitability. And when we look at just simple temperature measures, it's also highly correlated with things like degree days and other bioclimatic indices that we can talk about. If you look at Sauvignon Blanc and these regions that I put together, it's not exhaustive, but it's a pretty good measure. These 20 locations have an average range of growing season temperatures from 58.1 degrees Fahrenheit to 65.8. Or they have roughly a 7.7 degree Fahrenheit Sauvignon Blanc climate envelope, basically where it can be grown. This is roughly equivalent to 1,000 to 1,200 degree days in a standard format. Now, I've bookended a couple of places here in this data that I pulled together, and Central Otago is one of the coolest places growing any Sauvignon Blanc today. Ukiah is a little bit outside of this window of this Sauvignon Blanc production that I have here from climate perspective, mostly because it comes from the heart of the town and not actually out in the vineyards. The Lake County region is in the upper end of this area in Sauvignon Blanc's ripening window, and we can talk about that a little bit more. But to kind of go through and look at some different things, I thought I would put this diagram up. This is growing degree days from an equivalent of the first month of the year to the last month of the year. And again, Southern Hemisphere, Northern Hemisphere have been shifted. But do growing degree days in Sauvignon Blanc regions look the same? Hopefully you're saying no. They're quite different. They're quite different. And if you look at this, the differences, and here's all the different locations that I had in here, and I know it's probably pretty hard to pull this out, but this is a good spaghetti diagram to get started with. If you look at the averages, 2640 is the average growing degree days across all of these regions. The maximum is 3390, the minimum is 1811. And the differences, as far as I can tell from a climate perspective, are really that it's driven by diurnal temperature ranges, especially maximum temperatures. It's also driven by the length of the growing season and how that growing season truncates at the right time at the end of the year for that variety to be ripened. This is another piece of this that I think is important, this diurnal temperature range. Hopefully you can make this diagram out, because I know it's a little bit small, but on the y-axis here is the diurnal temperature range in August and September in the Northern Hemisphere, and February and March in the Southern Hemisphere, versus the growing degree days for each one of these regions. And there's a pretty decent relationship here, but when you break it down to where these regions are, I think is a really important component of this. First of all, these are all driven by vapor pressure deficits or differences in humidity. Pretty clear, okay? If you put a circle around this, all of the ones in blue here come from France, New Zealand, and Australia. These two over here are from Oregon. And the rest of these are from California. Now, the only outlier to this whole thing that, in terms of these three different circles, is Santa Maria, which is down along the coast in Central Coast, California. Its coastal zone ended up producing a fairly low diurnal temperature range at kind of low heat accumulation. And then if we look at just one location within this area, Clear Lake shows out as being right at this point. If you look at something like precipitation, and I know we don't often talk about it, but precipitation across Sauvignon Blanc regions is actually quite varied. It averages 32.2 inches across these areas, but interestingly, it has a range that's more than the average. So 32.8 inches of a range of rainfall across these regions. In terms of the growing season, just what happens within the 7-month growing season, the areas have a 17.4 inch range in that precipitation during that period. And if you look at the ratio of growing season to annual precipitation, you can see that most of the places in California especially, but even into parts of Oregon and parts of Australia, are fairly low, running about 15 to 20% growing season to annual rainfall. When you get to places like Bordeaux and places in New Zealand and a couple of places in Australia, you're looking at places that have 50 to 60, 65% of their annual rainfall during the growing season. So quite different environments. If we turn our attention just looking at Lake County in terms of numbers overall, a wide range of landscapes and climates suitable for, of course, a wide range of varieties. Roughly 28 to about 3,800 degree days here in the region. Last spring frost, of course, early to mid-April. How has it been this year? Okay.
There's still frost alert. Greg Graham says not till the end of May.
Yeah. Read my weather report that came out this morning and you'll know. Medium first fall frost is early November to early December, making for a fairly decent ending season. Frost-free period 200 to 250 days in the region, and annual precipitation somewhere between 33 and 45 inches. If we look at the characteristics for what I think are important Sauvignon Blanc kind of climate components, overall, I think elevation here is really important in terms of high ultraviolet radiation. Sauvignon Blanc does have some influences from high UV that tends to produce certain characteristics. And I think New Zealand is definitely a place where this occurs, and they know a little bit more about it than what we've done in terms of research here. I do think that high diurnal temperature range in a warm climate region like this is extremely important. Because, of course, it retains acid, making Sauvignon Blanc perform, I think, very well. I think it's also pretty critical that the season truncates pretty well in the fall, meaning that we're ripening in a time where the daytime temperatures are still a little warm, but nighttime temperatures are clearly dropping off. We clearly have the moderation effects of the lake here, but a combination of mountain valley breezes and kind of lake land breezes are really important in terms of overall enhancing the ability to grow Sauvignon Blanc in this region. So a little bit of a summary and discussion components, and hopefully we can use this to talk a little bit more about kind of what we know out there. Globally, Sauvignon Blanc climates are quite varied. Roughly, that 7.7 degree climate niche, or roughly running between 1,800 and about 3,400 growing degree days worldwide. That's a pretty wide range. There's about a 33-inch range in annual precipitation with quite a varied growing season percentage by region. The diurnal temperature ranges are tremendously different from about 18 degrees to about 43 degrees Fahrenheit during that last 2 months of the ripening period. Significant differences in vapor pressure deficit, I think, are the important component here. There's a compensation effect, of course, where we have higher maximum temperatures in a region. Then we tend to have lower minimum temperatures, and you have a pretty high diurnal temperature range. And this is especially evident in California. Places in which we have more humidity in the air, we tend to have lower maximum temperatures and higher nighttime temperatures. This is mostly what we find in France and parts of New Zealand and parts of Australia. I think there's a significant effect here that this results in how respiration metabolism occurs within the vine physiologically, and this really affects, I think, ripening and produces wine-style differences within Sauvignon Blanc worldwide. So, conclusions. I think there is some issues discussing average climates like I've been doing here in terms of different places worldwide. When you have one location representing a region, it's kind of an issue. But it's what we have to work with, and I think it does put a pretty good bookend on kind of understanding at least these broad-based differences. Sauvignon Blanc produces very well across a range of climates, and I think there's some important day-night temperature effects that produce some of the stylistic differences that we have. Lake County is a relatively warm Sauvignon Blanc region if you compare it to the rest of the world, but it has a much more continental climate, I think, that produces those low nighttime temperatures that really help the variety perform. I think also these high ultraviolet radiation, high diurnal temperature ranges, and moderating effects are really important overall. So I'm going to leave you with these two questions, and hopefully we can talk about them through the rest of the day. From all of this, is there an ideal climate for Sauvignon Blanc? It's a good question. And then the last one is that have the best places for Sauvignon Blanc to be produced been found? Either the best regions and or the best sites? It's kind of another good question. So I'll leave you with that, and thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. I really love Lake County and Lake County soils. I will say a few words about the soils of Lake County, starting, of course, with this citation. This is an article from Mike Dunn in the Sacramento Bee, and you notice that along some remarks about the climate, he also talks about Lake County's soils forms an unusually varied tapestry, and this is why perhaps, along with the small climatic variations, we have some such different styles of Sauvignon Blanc coming from Lake County as a result of that combination of both soils and climate here. As was said before by the organizer, the Clear Lake AVA was established in 1984. It was not the first one. Clear Lake itself, of course, which is the centerpiece of the county, is one of the largest natural lakes in California. Formed about 700 years ago by basically a massive landslide, which obturated basically the natural course of water since basically this drainage basin was draining towards the Russian River, towards Mendocino County, and then as a result of that landslide, things were reversed, and today basically the water flows towards the Central Valley, towards Sacramento, essentially through Cache Creek. So this has been seen again. There are now many Lake County AVAs which have been differentiated on the basis of small climatic or physiographic differences. Clear Lake, of course, is the big one, the general one, and then you have High Valley, which is a sort of a perched series of summits and valleys. You have also again, Red Hills AVA, which is on volcanic rocks. That's the distinguishing feature. And then you have Big Valley District and Caseyville Bench, which were differentiated from Clear Lake AVA more recently. And finally, you have Guinoc to the south, which was, I guess, the first AVA created, and Benmore Valley AVA, which is on the confines of a county close to Mendocino County, and which currently has very little grapes planted. So let's look a little bit at the Lake County general geology as the basis, as a substrate from which the soils developed through time as a result of the various soil-forming agents. There are three major soil types, basically, in this country. One is the Franciscan Formation, which was formed in the late Mesozoic. Then there are some Cenozoic sedimentary rocks and alluvium. There is also the Great Valley Sequence. And finally, some Cenozoic volcanic rocks, which are a little bit more recent, and which are underlying, among other things, the Red Hills, basically, viticultural area. The geologic history of a county cannot be differentiated, of course, from the geologic history of the North Coast as a whole. We are in a situation here of where you have a plate subduction with a farallon of a Pacific plate, basically, which is going under the American plate. And during that process, of course, were created the Sierra Nevada, and eventually all of the sediments which were eroded from the Sierra Nevada, which formed, the Great Valley Sequence and the Franciscan Complex. But there was a second ripple which eventually emerged, which is forming the Coast Range. And the Coast Range is basically the physiologic formation in which we find ourselves. And so Lake County specifically is located basically under that Franciscan assemblage, with a little bit of a Great Valley Sequence on the margins towards the Sacramento Valley. And of course, during that process of formation of a coast range and deposition and uplift of the Franciscan Formation and the coast range, you also had a lot of hydrogeothermal activity, and you had formation or intrusion of things like the serpentinitic rocks and over volcanic rocks, and of course a number of these volcanic also materials that we find on the high ridges of Napa Valley or here in the basically in the field. So what is the Franciscan Formation? It's really it's a complex or an assemblage. It's not very clear. It's not like the nice limestone plateaus that you find in some other areas of the world, basically. It's very heterogeneous. You have about 9 different blocks. The color is also varied. You have red, green, dark blue, everything in between. Also, the rocks have a folded, twisted appearance as a result of the compression and the uplift. And it contains a great variety, basically, of individual rock types, from mafic volcanic rocks, deep sea scherts, gray wax sandstones, limestone, serpentinites, shales, high-pressure metamorphic rocks. You have here a picture of a gray rock, which is known as a dirty sandstone, basically. Other types of rocks, again, shown here on this picture. You have shale and sandstone. You have pillow basalt, which is a volcanic rock. You have ribbon chert, which is a siliceous rock. You have a gray wax sandstone. I just showed it before. And also, of course, conglomerates as a result of high energy activity on the slope of a continental shelf. And then you have the volcanics, and they came sometimes a little bit later. It was mentioned that, for example, Mount Konocti was basically erupted for the last time in about 10,000 years ago. So probably humans were already in the area, as was already mentioned. And this Clear Lake volcanic field here is found essentially in the Red Hills area, and then in the southeast of the county, but also in High Valley, which is to the north of the lake, and where some of the best Sauvignon Blanc is produced, although not necessarily on the volcanic rocks. So these young volcanics have many, many aspects. And here is a classification which is based essentially on the content of silica. The highest silica content, which also happens to be the youngest in this set, is the rhyolite, which is forming the Mount Konocti basically slopes. And then you have the obsidian, the dark glass-like, which the natives actually traded, and some obsidian from Clear Lake has been found all the way to the Mississippi River. So you see there was an intense exchange there of that type of material. Then you have andesite, okay, like the ones you would find under the Snows Lake, for example, place, or basalt that you find more to the southeast of the country, which is a little bit more ancient. And of course, as you go from the rhyolite all the way to the basalt, you have an increase in iron and manganese. So there is a variation in the composition, and as well as a decrease in silica content. So that will, of course, affect soil formation. So the Red Hills area, and I'm going to start with this, even though Red Hills is primarily used, according to the literature today, for red varietals and very little for basically white varietals, although this is not necessarily true in other parts of the world. The old Falernian wines of the Romans, they were also on volcanic rocks, for example. So Clear Lake, again, is a very interesting area from that point of view because it's based a little bit on lithography. 90% of the grapes there are grown on volcanic soils. These are very well-drained soils. They are red in color, and basically they are also at slightly higher elevation, and essentially growing red. So you have 3 basically associations there of soils. Konocti, Ben Ridge. We'll find Ben Ridge also in High Valley later. Glenview, Bottle Rock, Arrowhead, and Kolayomi, Aiken, Whispering. And I have, again, some landscapes here which show a little bit that thing about Mount Konocti with the dacite, the pyroclastics, the breccia, and then the rolling hills, basically, such as Crimson Hills, for example, where Beckstoffer vineyards are, where you have Glenview, Bottle Rock, and the Arrowhead series on obsidian and pyroclastics. And finally, you have the southeastern hills, where a snow lake would be, where you will find colaiomi, lichen, whisperings. So these are soils on basically andesite and basalt. Okay? Here is a nice picture which was taken by the folks at Beckstoffer. I think Randy Craig took that. Again, it's a Glenview soil series with that nice obsidian glass there, which is in a matrix that results from the weathering from tephra and over volcanic ejecta. The second area that I also contains some volcanics is the High Valley AVA. It's essentially a perched valley. So it's a little bit colder. It has its own microclimate. And this is a place where good Sauvignon Blanc is actually produced. Among the soil series, you have some soils on volcanics, such as the Ben Ridge series, here on the left. Again, weathered dacite, pyroclastic, breccia, and so on. So these are deep, well-drained soils formed in amorphous materials. And in this case, the Ben Ridge is a well-developed soil, not so much because it's old, but because it's a climate which allows rapid weathering in a few millennia to produce a well-differentiated soil. And then you have the oversoils, which are on basically overparent material, such as, for example, Manzanita series that we will find somewhere else in the county. Also well-developed soils as a result of climate exposure. And finally, Wolf Creek series, which is underlying, among others, the Brassfield estate, where you have excellent Sauvignon Blanc, which is produced, which has been primed. And these are very young soils. Of course, there's a valley fill. They are really the product of recent weathering and accumulation in a closed valley. And as a result, they are very deep and allow deep rooting of the vines and large water availability. If you get out a little bit of areas which were defined and you go in the general AVA, Clear Lake, to the southeast of the lake a little bit, you have here, for example, the soils on basically Six Sigma Ranch, also a place which has been primed in terms of the quality of its Sauvignon Blanc. And here you see a variety of soils because you are already in the Franciscan Formation. There are no basically volcanic rocks there, and so you have things like the Milholm series, which is very shallow to the bedrock, so that's not necessarily a good thing in our case, especially for Sauvignon Blanc, which likes a little bit deeper soils. And then you have the Sky High series, which is basically the bottom of the vales, which is a little bit deeper and is also a more developed soil. Okay. And then you have Big Valley, and of course Big Valley is what everyone thinks about when we are talking about Sauvignon Blanc, even though we have seen that Sauvignon Blanc can be grown in other areas. And you have here a number of soil series, which are, for example, coal, which is a dominant soil series. It's also the one which is found extensively on the Oakville Bench in Napa Valley. You have Clear Lake, which is a vertisoil. You have Still, and you have Talmadge. So again, this include loams, sticky clays, some gravel, and all of these soils are fairly high in magnesium because, of course, they are being eroded or they are being developing on alluvial material, which was eroded from serpentinic rocks, which is high in magnesium. So here's a nice picture of High Valley with in the end, you see at the end, you see the lake, and you see also a pear orchard, because it turns out the county was essentially devoted to basically fruit growing, pears and plums and things like that, and walnuts before turning to viticulture in more recent times. So one of the main soils here in Big Valley is coal. So it's a soil which is very deep. It's somewhat developed below, but it's essentially deep because it's an alluvial soil, slowly permeable. Again, they have also a little bit of shrink swell clay in the subsoil, so it may stress plant. The root penetration is a little bit limited by that strong subsoil it has, but otherwise it's deep, and if the roots can find their way, it's nice. Manzanita, again, is another type of soil, also in Big Valley. Again, dark brown, reddish brown. These are also deep soils formed in alluvial sediment. Same thing for still. They all varied in texture and a few other properties, such as the gravel content, which also is important in the sense that gravel doesn't hold water. So the more gravel, basically, the less water available capacity you have in these soils. And then you have talmage, and talmage, again, is a gravelly sandy loam, so that one is really gravelly. It's the one you would expect to find in a place where you have basically Sauvignon Blanc. It's a soil, again, formed on alluvium, very deep. It's also very permeable. It's very basically well drained. It has a poor native fertility, however, but this is not impediment to growing vines, okay? And finally, it's also variable because of the stratification due to the alluvial deposition. Anyway, this is the Clear Lake soil series now. It's again found also in Napa Valley and many other places in the central coast. Again, it's vertisoil. It means it's a shrink swell soil. In summer, basically the soil dries up, and so it cracks open. So you have these deep cracks which go down to 1 meter depth, and of course you have organic matter that falls in the cracks. When winter comes, so do the rains basically again wet the soil expands, traps that organic matter which went down the cracks down to 1 meter. And of course what you see here is a very dark soil because it has incorporated through these annual cycles a lot of organic matter at great depth. And so you have these, or basically clay minerals which are coated with humus and other dark organic matter particles. But these soils are not necessarily the best because they also shrink and swell. They damage actually the young roots of the vines, and they can be detrimental in some sites. However, they are used, and with success, to grow things like Sauvignon Blanc. Okay, and I even think that the Mondavi vineyard in Tokalon actually has some of the Clear Lake soil series where they grow some of the Sauvignon Blanc used for the famous Tokalon Fumé Blanc. But you have some also in High Valley and even in this area also. Okay. Now, Kelsey Bench is a little bit above Big Valley. And that one, you also have high terraces, so you have soils which are a little bit older. And in addition, you have also some soils on bedrock directly because you have also some rolling hills on the upper part of that AVA. One of the soils I didn't talk about, which is one of the main components here, is the Forbesville series. Again, it's a soil which is on all terraces. It's why it's called Ultic Palexeralf. It's because it has been there for quite a bit of time, and it's well leached, and it's poor in nutrients. And at the same time, it also has a lot of clay and other fines which can hold water. Finally, there is an area that was talking about because it's one of the first AVAs created, or the first AVA created in the county. It's the Genoc Valley area, the Langtree Estates and Vineyards, which are pictured here. So you see these hills which come out of that flat alluvial plain, and it is in fact a flat alluvial plain. So these rocks that you see, they are basically the Franciscan Formation, but you also have a tremendous amount of serpentine there, which is why you have an over-verti soil, shrink and swell. This one, the Maxwell soil, which has clays which are extremely rich in magnesium. So technically speaking, you would say, well, maybe it's not that good. Again, it's mostly for serpentinic rocks. The other one, still, that we have seen already, and Kelsey, which is also named for one of the localities, again, are also sedimentary soils. So all of them basically correspond to soils which are in low floodplains or places which are low terraces, recent alluvial deposits. None of these soils has really a very differentiated profile. What they have is successive layers of sediment which change slowly, okay? So very deep. And for Sauvignon Blanc, again, it's not necessarily an impediment, it's even an advantage. So soil management in a mountainous area is always a problem, especially with regard to soil erosion. This is an example of an old walnut orchard. You know that walnut leaves basically suppress grass growth, and so if you don't have grass and you have rainfall, so you know, you have a lot of erosion, so a lot of soils in this area, especially here in the Red Hills, which is not the center of our talk today, but have lost their topsoil because it was washed away, and so you have rills, you have things like that. Or in some cases, you have a protective pavement of obsidian that results from the washing away of the fines, so you have some kind of a stabilization. So cover crops are sometimes essential when you actually grow vines here on slopes, okay? Then there is another problem which is specific here to the Coast Range and the western part of the San Joaquin Valley. It's the high magnesium which we find in the soils, which results from its presence in basically chrysotyl serpentine, you know, asbestos serpentine if you want. And sometimes there is so much of that magnesium that the base saturation of the soil is greater than 60%, the base saturation with magnesium only, okay? In fact, magnesium is not supposed to be above 20%, and calcium is supposed to be about 60–70%. You also have in these soils high levels of manganese and nickel, which is not very good either. And so these soils eventually, because of the presence of that high magnesium, deflocculate and form impermeable pans, basically, and so you have waterlogging, which is a strong possibility. So again, to reclaim these soils which are high in serpentine, you have to apply, of course, gypsum or calcium in sufficient quantities, as well as potassium, to try to override a little bit the detrimental effects of magnesium, which also has consequences in terms of plant vigor. It sort of devigorates the plants and eventually also induces deficiencies of potassium and calcium in these plants. So again, this one is out of place. I wanted to show the soil erodibility in Lake County following the previous slide. So, of course, in prime farmland, you see here, for example, the Big Valley area and other places, you do have some soil erosion potential, which is moderate to high. Again, as long as you have some crop cover or some other practices, you can avoid that type of thing. Finally, I found this article, which was basically summarized by a friend of mine, Bibiana Guerra, who looked at a 2005 paper from Bordeaux. And what these folks did, they did basically a 2-year Sauvignon Blanc study and said which type of soil is better for Sauvignon Blanc. And they came up with following basically conclusions, and let's see if some of them apply here in Lake County. They said, for maximum aroma expression, irrigated Sauvignon Blanc should be watered to achieve and maintain a mild water deficit level, and nitrogen deficiency should be avoided. Whereas shallow and gravelly soils are better suited for high potential red grape production, deeper soils are those best adapted for Sauvignon Blanc. Certainly, Lake County has quite an array of deeper soils, and it's therefore interesting to note that some of the places which are considered best in the county here for Sauvignon Blanc, like High Valley and Big Valley and so on, are in fact places which have fairly deep alluvial soils. So again, I'm going to conclude on this last verse. So, you know, enjoy your Sauvignon Blanc wine in Lake County. I really love this place. And here are some references and acknowledgement. We did actually a study here in Lake County of some of the soils, mineralogical study, but it was unfortunately only on the Red Hills area because we were interested primarily in the volcanic soils. So we didn't get to go to Big Valley and other places where, again, which are more of a domain of Sauvignon Blanc. Although I don't know if there is really any Sauvignon Blanc also on the volcanic rocks of Red Hill, maybe perhaps in High Valley. So thank you for your attention.